Today was day 24 in Karen Reed's retrial. We started off the day with some oral argument on the defense's motion for a directed verdict. Now, in different jurisdictions, they call this motion different things. In Massachusetts, they call it something else. But essentially, it's all the same idea. And the idea is that after the Commonwealth has finished with their case in chief, they've presented all of their evidence, and now it's the defense's turn to go. Before the defense even presents any sort of evidence, they can make this motion asking the judge to dismiss the case at this point. Why? Because the argument goes that even despite all of the evidence that the Commonwealth has put on, all 23 days of evidence and witness testimony that they've put on, still a reasonable juror cannot conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that Karen Reed killed John O'Keefe and is guilty of any of the charges. So this is how the motion goes. They argued this motion, and 99% of the time these motions are denied, and that's exactly what happened in this case, which surprised nobody. So we had Alan Jackson argue, then Brennan argued, and they argued the different evidence. We don't have to go through and rehash all the evidence pointing one way or the other way. But ultimately, Judge Cannone very quickly denied the motion. Now, there was one argument that was not made by Alan Jackson, which I think he could have made. And perhaps we'll hear this type of argument in closing argument. I think I would argue this before I argue other things, but I think that this is a argument that could be made by closing. And that is the following. Even if we are to take all of the Commonwealth's witnesses at face value and assume that they're all credible and assume that all the data is accurate and ignore all of the defense's experts or all the defense's witnesses, let's just live in that world for a moment. What have they proven? They've proven a few important parts. Number one, Dr. Wolf, the neurosurgeon, his opinion is very clear that this injury that killed John O'Keefe was the blunt force trauma to the back of his head, which Dr. Scordi-Bello also agreed with. That is what killed him. The injuries to his arm did not kill him. It's that he fell backwards. And according to Dr. Wolf, that injury could have only come from him falling backwards, not from a crowbar, not from a baseball bat. Okay, so let's just assume that for a moment. Now, when did John O'Keefe get that? How do we know when he got that and who caused that? Has the Commonwealth proven at all who caused John O'Keefe's trauma to the back of his head? So let's think about this for a moment. What did the Commonwealth prove with all their experts? Dr. Welcher, for example. Well, what they did prove, if we are again to just assume that all of their witnesses are 100% accurate and credible, that Karen Reed threw her car into reverse, and at some point above 8 miles per hour, and that's the extent of what Dr. Welcher's opinion is. He can't say how fast she was going when she hit him. So at some point above 8 miles per hour, her taillight hit John O'Keefe in his arm and caused those abrasions to his arm. Okay, let's assume that. Now, at what point did John O'Keefe fall? Have they proven that because of the interaction with Karen Reed's Lexus and John O'Keefe's arm, have they proven that that's what caused John O'Keefe to fall on the back of his head? Did they prove that? Well, what they have proven is that there is this injury to the back of John O'Keefe's head, right? They've proven that, shown pictures, and that's what the doctors testified about. But how do we know how that was caused? How do we know when exactly he fell backwards? How do we know that maybe he got hit by Karen Reed with the Lexus? He was very upset about it because he got all these abrasions on his arm. She took off. She's going home and she's upset. And now he's just walking around being drunk in his drunken state. And he was extremely drunk at that time. That's what the evidence showed. And as Dr. Wolf said, which happens all the time, which he's seen many cases of when he was working in Minnesota, that drunken people fall. And maybe he just fell and slipped and hit his head backwards. Is that not a reasonable proposition? Is that not a reasonable possibility that could have happened in this case? And tell me if it's not, show me what piece of evidence from the Commonwealth proves that he did not do that. Prove to me that Karen Reed backed up her Lexus, hit him in the arm, and that's what caused him to spin and fall and land on his head. Now, with all of Trooper Paul's faults, his opinion was that that's exactly what happened. So at least in last trial, we had Trooper Paul, who was a Commonwealth witness, and this is why maybe at last trial you couldn't make this type of argument. Because Trooper Paul, with all of his blemishes, he did opine that John O'Keefe was spun around and fell backwards and smashed his head. That was his testimony. So you wouldn't be able to use this argument. But in this case, they haven't produced any evidence that, or any opinions at all, that John O'Keefe was spun around because of Karen Reed backing up her car into his arm. And because of that, he ended up smashing his head on the ground. There was no evidence presented like that at all. And therefore, automatically, you should argue that that's reasonable doubt. And that's before you even get to any of the defense's witnesses. So I think that is a reasonable argument, and we'll see if the defense actually argues this in closing. Okay, so let's move on to the first and only witness of today for the defense, Matthew Dogra. Now, Matthew Dogra, first of all, one of the things that you're supposed to do as a juror, and the judge tells you about this, is to look at the manner and how someone's testifying. Look if they're trying to be evasive. And we've spoken about this before during this trial, because let's just take Yuri Buchanan, which is an obvious example. That's a person who was not forthcoming, someone whose his manner of testimony was that he was not being honest, right? He's trying to be evasive. That's something that the jurors are instructed to take into account when deciding the credibility of witnesses. So that's something that you have to always consider when you're looking at these witnesses when they're testifying. And something that you saw today with Dogra is that he was being very forthcoming. He was being very honest. And even on cross-examination, when Hank Brennan was getting worked up about it, he was more or less forthcoming about his opinions. And when something was a yes or no, he was able to answer it by and large with a yes or no, if he was able to, and he did. So just in terms of manner and testimony, I think Dogra did a good job showing that he's being forthcoming. And the things that he didn't do, he didn't try to qualify or explain away. He just said, yeah, this is what I did. This was the scope of my work. And yeah, I'm not an expert in all those things that you're mentioning now. That's fine. I'm not an expert. This was the scope of my work. This is what I did. I reviewed the reports, and that's it. So just in terms of that, I think he did a good job. Now, let's talk about some of the direct examination, and then we'll move on to the cross-examination. So first, Alan Jackson went through some of his background, some of his education, and his papers and his teachings. Okay, so we went through some of that. And then eventually he got onto what his scope of work was in this case. And now his scope of work was that he was supposed to review, and he did review, Shannon Burgess's report. Seems to be his main job. Now, also in that report, it seems that he reviewed some of Dr. Welcher's reports as well. So he reviewed these reports, and this actually was interesting pre-trial because he was the one who noticed that Shannon Burgess mixed up bits and bytes. So he kind of pointed that out in an affidavit. This guy doesn't really know what he's talking about when it comes to bits and bytes. So that was in his affidavit. So that was the first thing. And what happened was that in January of 2025, that's when Burgess issued his first report. So Dogra looked at the report, and after looking at the report, he realized that even with all of his calculations, still there's a very important trigger. There's a very important event, a lock phone event, when John O'Keefe locked his phone for the last time. Okay, now obviously that had to have happened in the Commonwealth's theory before he was hit. He wasn't hit and then took out his phone and said, yeah, I better lock this phone. That's probably not what happened. So they have to show that, according to all the data, he locked that phone before he was hit. It has to be in the realm of possibility at least. And in Burgess's January report, it was not in the realm of possibility. And that's what Dogra pointed out. Going through all the calculations, it just simply didn't add up. And all of the calculations, the locking event for John O'Keefe's phone occurred after the 1162-2 event, which is what the Commonwealth is referring to, the collision in this case, and therefore their theory's out the window. So they have to go back to the drawing board. Burgess had to go back to the drawing board, and he did. And that's why he issued a new report in May. And he said, we're not going to use some of the other data to reconcile these clocks. Now, remember, this is where the clocks come in, and this is where people start getting a little confused. But the idea here is that there's a variance. There's a difference between the phone clock that John O'Keefe had on his phone and the Lexus clock. There's always going to be a little bit of a variance. And this is something that the experts have to teach us, how to rectify and correct the variance to show how everything lines up. So in the first report, he was using one data set, which, according to those points didn't add up. And that's what Dogra pointed out. So then in the second report in May, which was issued in the middle of trial, which the defense vehemently objected to, which they have a pretty good point about, that's when Burgess amended his report and decided to use a different data point, a different starting point, which was the 3-point turn, as we've heard about a lot about this 3-point turn, which happened a little bit before this 1162 event, which 1162-2 event, which they're referring to as the collision. So in the second report, he used the 3-point turn as a data point. Okay, so that is how he changed it. And if you use that, then there are situations with that report that the locking of John O'Keefe's phone occurred before he was hit, or before the event of 1162-2 ended, which means that he could have technically got locked his phone before he got hit. Okay, so that's what he amended, and obviously that's why it's a very important part of the case, whether that report is going to be allowed in. And okay, Judge Cannoni did allow it in, and he testified to that. So something also that he mentioned, Dogra, is the fact that we all recall that Aperture bought this Lexus, an exemplar Lexus, to do this testing on, as we saw, the blue paint and some other testing that they were doing with this car. Well, one of the things that they did with the testing of this car was when you push and the start and stop button, how much longer is there a lag between the push and the start and stop button when you push it and when the infotainment system goes on. So there is actually, and there's two different clocks in the Lexus which record the push start, the stop and start, and the infotainment system. And it turns out that there's a 3-second lag. So here's the issue that Dogra pointed out, which is, again, a very interesting issue. They used one Lexus exemplar. Now, when you're doing testing and you want to say with a degree of confidence that this is how Karen Reed's Lexus would have reacted also, well, then how can you just use one Lexus? Are you going to assume that all Lexuses work exactly the same because you used one Lexus exemplar? So what Dogra was just saying is that, scientifically, using a scientific method, you should really be using more exemplars. Don't just use one Lexus, even though you're right, they're very similar. They all line up in different, but you don't know if every infotainment system with every single Lexus reacts the same. I mean, this is just the basic of scientific experiment, right? You got to try it a few times with a few different Lexuses, and to see if they all have this 3-second lag, then you can assume that there's a 3-second lag there. And that's just something you pointed out, that they're doing all this testing with this Lexus exemplar, and that's just one test with not one test, but one Lexus exemplar. And really, if you want to do it appropriately, you got to do it with a number of Lexuses. Okay, then also he pointed out that Burgess actually did not apply this 3-second lag. So number one, he said, we don't even know if this 3-second lag is accurate and if it's applicable to Karen Reed's Lexus. But even if we do, Burgess just kind of forgot about that. And in this case, seconds actually really matter. So that was just something that he mentioned. Also, the fact that he didn't account for all the possibilities. Burgess centered in on one possibility and showed how it's possible that he locked his phone, that John O'Keefe locked his phone before he got hit, but he didn't account for any of the other possibilities. So if you want to be as honest as possible, then as an expert, you should say, look, if we do it this way, you'll get these possibilities. If you do it that way, you'll get these possibilities. And yeah, according to some of the possibilities, this accident can actually work out in the Commonwealth's theory. But don't just say one possibility and ignore all the rest. It's not being intellectually honest. So that's just something also that he pointed out in the report. He says that's what an expert is supposed to do. So he showed that all of the possibilities, even if you don't use the 3-point turn, if there's other possibilities to also use in order to get the correct variance in between the phone and the Lexus infotainment system, they all valid approaches. And he says that there's no literature specifically that says that one way to do this, one method, one point of time is a better way to do it than any other point of time. So if there's no literature and there's no research saying to use a 3-point turn is better for aligning clocks and accounting for the variance, well then, why should we just trust Burgess because he says that that's a better way to do it? There's no method that's been accepted by the engineering community about this. So there's no literature, there's no research, there's no nothing, he said. So, I mean, yeah, it's a possibility, but there's also a bunch of other possibilities. Now, another thing that he pointed out was again very compelling is that he showed on one of his graphs, on one of his slides, that if you account for the 3-second delay, then still it's not possible that he locked this phone before he got hit. That's number one. Number two is he said that even using Burgess's report and all of his assumptions and using his point, then you are still, from all the possibilities in this experiment, all the possibilities, you're still going to have 25 out of 30 possibilities where the locking event happens after 1162 is over. So if you take a step back and don't just jump into and assume that what Burgess's possibility is the one that happened, but if you account for all possibilities, which you can argue a jury should do, they shouldn't just discount all the possibilities, it's a reasonable possibility, then 25 out of the 30 say that he locked his phone after the 1162-2 event, which again would mean that he did not get hit by Karen Reed with the 1162-2 text stream event. Now, he said that there's only actually 3 of 30 possibilities where the locking event occurred before. So even using all of Shannon Burgess's data, still you're going to have only 3 out of 30 possibilities where the locking event happened before. Okay, and then he also brought out the fact that the text stream event doesn't mean that there's a collision. There's 19 total text stream events, and then later in redirect he brought out that there's like 11 that happened after this 1162-2 event. So there can be a lot of text stream events on this car, which does not mean that there was a collision, obviously. And that was very clear already. It's been clear before, but now it was another point that he brought out with Dogra. Okay, and then we had cross-examination. What Brennan really wanted to focus on was the fact that Dogra's job was to review Aperture's work. That's really what he did. He didn't perform any of these tests himself. He didn't download any of these tests himself. He was just reviewing their work and taking out a calculator and seeing if the times actually match up. And he still found some issues. So, but Brennan was trying to say that, look, you didn't look at the data yourself, right? You didn't download the data. You're just assuming that everything that Burgess says in his report is actually accurate, which, again, I don't know if that's a great line of questioning, because all that suggests is that you're right. I relied on your expert. If your expert messed up the data, then you're right. I don't know what to tell you. I didn't do my own personal download of this of the infotainment system, and I didn't do any of the chip offs. I watched them do it, but I didn't do it personally, and I didn't look at the data myself. So yeah, you're right. If Burgess messed up on his report, then you're 100% right. My report's garbage. But the problem with that also is that you have to realize that Dr. Welcher also relied on Burgess's report. Dr. Welcher is the Commonwealth's case in this time around, because he's the one that's showing how this interaction could have happened, right? He's the saving grace for Trooper Paul in this case. He's the real PhD. He did an accident reconstruction, and with his testimony, they're going to argue that this Lexus actually it's reasonable or probable or whatever, beyond a reasonable doubt, that she actually backed the Lexus out into Karen and John O'Keefe and hit his arm and caused those abrasions. So Dr. Welcher is also relying heavily on Shannon Burgess's report also. So if you're trying to say that, well, you're only relying on Shannon Burgess's report, well, yeah, your expert also is. Welcher didn't do all the testing that Burgess did, or the downloading that Burgess did. He's also relying on his report. So yeah, I mean, this is the point that Alan Jackson made, is that, yeah, basically garbage in, garbage out, that would apply for everybody in this case. So, but he did spend a lot of time on that. Now, he also pointed out that in the EDR data, it would not register anything for side swipes. And you'd have to look elsewhere to see whether there is an actual collision, because since the text stream data doesn't show you definitely that there is a collision, you'd have to look at other factors, which he didn't do, obviously. And he's like, yeah, I don't have an opinion one way or the other whether a collision happened or not. I'm just telling you about their data, the data that I saw in their report, and telling you how the times actually match up and all the different possibilities of the time. So, yeah, so he brought out that. Now, also something that came out with his cross-examination, actually, interestingly, and it's interesting that this is not brought out in direct, but this is brought out that Burgess went to go do another, there was a chip off in this case, right? So Burgess had to go and take some of the data off the Lexus, right? All the modules, and do this process called a chip off. And part of the reason why Burgess wanted to go back and do some more chip offs is that he was under the incorrect assumption that there's a difference between bits and bytes, and he mixed himself up, and therefore he assumed that all the data was really not taken off of the car, when really all the data was taken off the car. But eventually what he did was he was able to get the SD card off, and when he got the SD card off, then he was able to locate some other data that he had no idea existed even. So it turns out that for all the wrong reasons, and for all the reasons that he didn't realize, Burgess did find some extra data on the SD card. But initially, his whole basis for that was because he mixed up bits and bytes. And eventually, okay, he did get the SD card. But something was interesting is that Dogra testified that one of his jobs was that he was hired to do was to accompany Burgess when he did this chip off. And what was interesting is that you're supposed to write a protocol, which is what you're going to do. Like, this is exactly what I'm going to do. This is the protocol. And then when you get to the scene, you follow the protocol. That's what you're supposed to do when you're an expert like this. Well, what did Burgess do? So Dogra, this actually came out on cross-examination. So what Dogra actually did, what Burgess actually did in front of Dogra, because he was there, is that he went off script. He did not follow his protocol. And he decided that he's going to do this chip off, I guess, with the SD card. And okay, eventually it did lead to some data, but Dogra just said it was odd. because that's not usually how experts operate. So again, what you're seeing a lot with Burgess is that this is not a real expert. He writes up a protocol and then he goes off script. So he's not operating the way experts operate. And he mixed up bits and bytes, and he doesn't have a bachelor's, and so you keep hearing more things like this from the jury, and it can really start to make you discredit even more Burgess, in case that was not completely done yet. Okay, so moving on, then we got to some redirect. Okay, so we got to redirect, and I want to show you one part of the redirect, because this is really like probably one of the best parts of the redirect. And you all will recall about Shannon Burgess and the CV issue and the bachelor's issue. So it's also interesting that this not come out on direct examination. Alan Jackson waited for redirect, but listen to the questioning here.
Specifically, you were asked about your expertise regarding mobile devices and their data, correct?
Yes.
And were you being truthful when you indicated that you were not an expert in that field? Were you being truthful when you indicated that you have a certain expertise in EDR data?
Yes.
Were you being truthful when you indicated that you did review Mr. Burgess's data and Mr. Welcher's data as reflected in their reports and PowerPoints?
Yes.
Were you being truthful about your credentials?
Yes.
Have you ever lied about your credentials?
No.
You hold a bachelor's degree?
Yes.
And you hold a master's degree?
I do.
You ever lied to anybody about that?
No.
So that was just just a nice point to kind of end on this with this witness, to let him know, hey, talking about it. And actually, one of the things that Hank Brennan tried to do is he tried to say that during that chip off, Burgess showed great proficiency for what he was doing, trying to build him up. And then Jackson gets up there and says, oh, have you ever lied about your credentials? Do you actually have a bachelor's? And that just completely takes the wind out of those sails. So that was essentially what happened with Dogra. To make one more very good point that Brennan actually made was that he did get Dogra to say this. He got Dogra to say that it would be more reliable to use a 3-point turn as one of the data point to try to figure out the account for the variance between the phone and the infotainment system. Now, initially, remember, in this direct examination, he kind of left it wide open, saying, well, there's no literature one way or the other, but he did eventually get him to say that it's more reliable. So he did get that point in. Again, it's still possible from all the other possibilities that the phone variance was more than that, which is something that we're probably going to hear more about in closing based on this witness's testimony. So that was essentially the testimony here. So then at the end of the trial today, after the jury was excused for the day, we had some additional arguments. And this is very interesting because the question really here is the defense going to call Michael Proctor? And they called in one of Michael Proctor's old friends who was on this texting chain. And again, it seems that this texting chain, which we heard about in the first trial, where Michael Proctor is saying some very vile stuff, these other people were part of the texting chain. And for some reason, or the next, which I can't really wrap my head around, the defense seems like they're posturing that they're not going to call Michael Proctor, which, again, I don't understand. I think that if I was trying this case, if I was defending Karen Reed, I would absolutely call Michael Proctor, because I understand the argument that you can be making in closing, saying this must be, again, this would be the argument to the jury, this must be the first murder case ever where the lead investigator was not called by the Commonwealth. That's how little confidence they have in their case. Now, I understand that argument, and it's very compelling, I think. I think even more compelling is to tell the jury, we called Michael Proctor. You know why we called Michael Proctor? Because we want you to hear all of the evidence. We're searching for the truth here. The Commonwealth apparently doesn't want to call certain witnesses. They want to hide some information from you. They tried to hide Michael Proctor, but as the defense, we don't think that that's right. Therefore, we're going to call Michael Proctor, and we did call Michael Proctor. And then when you get Michael Proctor to take the stand, it's an adverse witness. You can cross-examine, you can use leading questions, and you bring him and you just pound, ground and pound. And you bring out these text messages, all the bad information. And then, if the Hank Brennan wants to try to rehabilitate him after that, go right ahead. Do your best. But I don't know what the posture, I'm not sure what the strategy is by the defense. But it seems like they want to get these other people to authenticate these text messages, which would show Michael Proctor's character and bias about how the homeowner's not going to catch any grief in this because he's a Boston cop, and saying vile things about David Yannetti and about Karen Reed, all those nasty texts that we saw from last trial. And they want to get this in through this other witness. And this is what they were arguing about at the end of trial, whether this other witness can authenticate it. So Hank Brennan was making the argument that this witness does not have an individual recollection or independent recollection of these text messages. So therefore, he cannot authenticate these text messages. And authentication is just simply that you have a witness to say that the document is what it purports to be. So yeah, these are our text messages. They are from Michael Proctor, and this is what they said and say. So that's what you need to do when you want to produce, when you want to admit evidence. So this is what they're trying to do with this witness. And that's why there was a voir dire today, not in the presence of the jury, about this witness. And then there was oral argument about whether this is a way, first of all, number one, authentication purposes. Can this witness authenticate them without an individual recollection? And Yannetti made a pretty strong argument, citing a lot of case law, that you don't need an independent recollection. You can use circumstance, you can use context to admit these and authenticate these records. And that was for the authentication argument. The second argument here was that it was hearsay. It's hearsay. And the argument against that, of course, it's not hearsay. I mean, it's not hearsay because it's not being offered to prove the matter asserted. I mean, we're not trying to prove that Karen Reed is all these terrible things. We're trying to introduce these to show Michael Proctor's bias and the way that he handled this investigation. So that's why they're introducing it. And that's more of an argument. And so Hank Brennan didn't really argue so much with that. Hank Brennan argued that, I'm not going to, if they call Michael Proctor, then you can go and impeach him and show him these records and do what you did last trial. It sounds like he's like daring them to call Michael Proctor, which is why I don't understand really this dance. I think if I was the defense, I'd be more than happy to call Michael Proctor. So I don't know exactly the strategy here. And maybe one of the ideas that I thought maybe is a possibility is maybe their strategy is that they want to get the text messages in before they call Michael Proctor and then call Michael Proctor afterwards. I'm not exactly sure what the strategy here is, but it seems like they're posturing that they're not going to call Michael Proctor, which I think, again, is a mistake if you're the defense. I think you want to call them and then make that argument to the jury that we had to call the lead investigator in the case. That's how bad this case is, that we called the lead investigator. But anyway, so that's what that. So that is going to be it for today. And unfortunately, as some of you may know, I will not be around Monday and Tuesday because we have a Jewish holiday. So I will not be able to do the recaps on Monday and Tuesday, but I will be right back on here Wednesday for the live stream. So join us Wednesday, assuming that there is trial on Wednesday. I haven't heard anything different, so I'm assuming there's going to be trial on Wednesday, and we'll continue with the Karen Reed trial then. So until then, everybody have a great weekend. Thank you all for tuning in. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and like, and we will see you next time.